Good evening, members, evening people watching remotely. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Corporate Services, Climate Change and Scrutiny Management Call-in Committee. Today, Monday, the 4th of November. I'll begin by noting apologies. We've had apologies from Councillor Melly, who is substituted by Councillor Moroney. Welcome to your first call-in meeting, Councillor Moroney. You'll soon get the hang of it. Declarations of interest. Can I ask any members to indicate if they have any interests that they wish to declare that are not featured on their register of members' interests? No. Thank you. Agenda item 3, the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of August 2024. Does anyone have any matters of accuracy arising from those minutes? No, so we're happy to agree those as an accurate record. Yep, thank you. Agenda item for public participation. We have no registered speakers at today's meeting. Which brings us on to the main substantive item, which is the decision taken by the executive on the 10th of October 2024 in respect of community contracts to support early intervention and prevention in adult social care. Members will have seen from the paperwork that's being circulated ahead of the meeting that some but not all of the grounds for call-in have been upheld or have been permitted to go forward for debate at this evening's meeting. Probably helpful for me just to clarify those at the outset in terms of the grounds that have been ruled as valid. And those are the claim that the decision is contrary to or not wholly consistent with the budget, and the decision does not follow principles of good decision making set out in Article 7 of the Council's Constitution in respect of meaningfully considering all alternatives and taking account of all relevant matters, both in general and specific, and ignore any irrelevant matters. So those are the grounds that we'll be considering this evening, and I would ask members of the committee and calling in members as well to bear that in mind as we move forward with the discussion this evening. So how the meeting will run, I will invite the calling in members to speak to the committee, and Councillors Runciman and Vassie, you will have between you up to 10 minutes to address the committee. There'll then be 20 minutes for question and answers. There'll then be an opportunity for the executive member to address the committee for up to 10 minutes, and then there'll be a 20-minute opportunity for members to question the executive member. I had on my no, I was expecting Councillor Steels-Walshaw, but Councillor Lomas, you're here as well, so welcome. I just want to check that's okay.
That's absolutely fine, Chair. I should imagine Councillor Lomas is here to support Councillor Steels-Walshaw, and that there are some budget-specific aspects to the call-in that has been submitted.
Thank you. I'll then invite the calling in members. We'll have up to 5 minutes to make any concluding remarks. The executive members will have up to 5 minutes to make any concluding remarks. Then I will open it up for contributions from members of the committee before we take a vote. So I think that is all the introductory blurb, other than to make my usual reminder. The conduct of the meeting is intended to be inquisitorial rather than adversarial, and the issue under debate is not whether members agree with the decision. It's about the basis on which the decision was made, and the information that was provided to support that decision. So, with no further ado, I will invite Councillors Runciman and Vassie to address the committee on their reasons for calling in this decision. And I'll give you an indication if you're going over your 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. In the budget process, the public was told the cuts we would see in the community contract saving as agreed would be to remove duplication and to generate efficiencies in services. The papers presented to the executive did not show that the services which were to end were duplications of other services being provided or would improve efficiency. The evidence is that contracts such as the one the council held with the independent care group has resulted in a loss of specialised services with no similar provision in its place. This does not increase efficiency. The paper also fails to highlight all alternatives. The options that were laid out were to accept this specific set of cuts or not to renew any of the contracts. There was no mention of the option to renew all of the contracts or any discussion within the paper of an alternative spread of cuts, such as a 10% decrease across the board. Liberal Democrats would make none of these cuts, so we do not lose any of the specialist care provision. Also, the paper did not refer to the totality of the contracts within the scope of the review. There was no reference to the York Mind contract, the Yorkshire Housing Limited contract, or the Community Links contract in the paper. The funding for these makes up the bulk of the saving. There was also no reference to the specific savings target which this paper is supposed to cover and the reason for the cuts to begin with. There's also no reference to the uplifts in the other contracts. Some of the funding cuts in the paper are being repurposed to fill other gaps in funding. There's no reference to which community contracts will be extended beyond March 2025 when these contracts end, which will make for some organisations significant difficulties. Additionally, there is no mention within the paper about the breakdown of the costs of the short-term contracted services, including advice, information, shopping and befriending, and the dementia day clubs. These are the temporary services that have replaced the Age UK contract, and it seems the executive did not have the information as to whether or not the value of these is sufficiently covered by the funding approved. Throughout the report, there's no analysis of what the existing provision is and what will be the comparison with the new service to allow an informed decision. Over 600k of contracts will end as a result of this decision, and no analysis is made of the impact of the loss of these services and whether the mitigation within the new contracts is sufficient or correctly targeted. We find that it is impossible for the executive to have made the decision to end all of these contracts without all of the information and options as set out by our call-in request. We ask the executive to think again, review the decisions and revise them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Vassy, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Chair. My comments will be restricted to the cutting of funding to the York Age UK day clubs.
Point of order, Chair. That's been ruled invalid in the call-in.
Sorry, the Age UK contracts are referenced in the report. I know that the day clubs were used in support of one of the grounds for call-in. I don't think that precludes them from being raised in relation to the other grounds for call-in that have been ruled as valid. Carry on.
Sorry, Chair, I would disagree with that. The decision of the monitoring officer in determining which aspects of the calling would be valid specifically preclude those parts of the calling that refer to the Age UK contract. So his view is that the remaining parts that are valid do not cover any aspect of the Age UK contract. So they should not be under debate this evening.
how I think we've always approached these discussions is what was ruled invalid were the grounds for calling. Obviously, in the text used by the call-in members, they referred to some aspects of the services covered by the paper. I think it's a bit of a leap to say, because elsewhere we're looking at decision not wholly not wholly consistent with the budget, does not follow principles of good decision making. I've never understood it to be the case that because you mention one particular service in setting out one of the calling grounds, that you're then not allowed to mention that particular service when covering some of the other valid grounds.
Yeah, so Chair, it's specifically in the calling in meeting, look specifically at the aspects of the calling request that have been deemed to be valid. And it's the monitoring officer's view that the aspects that have been deemed valid do not include any reference to the Age UK contract specifically. Therefore, members shouldn't be debating any of those contracts as part of the call-in process this evening. So you're debating the three aspects of the call-in request that were deemed valid.
None of which is service specific, but I will bring other members in who would like to contribute. Councillor Rose.
Yeah, I mean, I come to this committee / call-in already pretty unhappy that we're here during a by-election. It feels like this was a very politically charged call-in specifically on a topic that the Lib Dems have been bringing through the press, which is the Age UK day clubs. We just heard the phrase, the Liberal Democrats wouldn't make any of these cuts. And we're going to get into, well, we wouldn't overspend, and we're going to get into all this political stuff if we start going down this road. The monitoring officer said this isn't part of the valid side of the call-in. We need to close off that avenue of conversation before everyone starts bringing things in that are sort of tangentially related but aren't actually part of the call-in.
Okay, Councillor Eyre.
Yeah, I'm confused by the views of the monitoring officer. I'd like you to clarify. So, top of page 104, valid reasons for calling. Saving agreed was to remove duplication and to generate efficiencies in services. One of those that was taken away was the Age UK contract. So it's valid for the call-in to discuss whether there was duplication or efficiency in ending that contract. Furthermore, at the bottom of page 104, again, by the monitoring officer, as valid for call-in, over 600,000 of contracts will end as a result, one of which is the Age UK day clubs. No analysis is made of the impact of the loss of these services and whether the mitigation within the new contracts is sufficiently or correctly targeted. Therefore, we can discuss the ending of the Age UK contract, whether the fact that it ended, the impact of the loss, which I suspect the calling member is about to articulate, and whether the mitigation in the new contracts mitigates the loss of the Age UK contract. That's specific within the valid calling. What was ruled out of order was literally the paper does not act in the interest of the public. The public is not served by that. I agree, and we're not going to discuss whether or not the views of the public were adequately taken in, but the monitoring officer has explicitly said we can discuss the impact of the loss of the contracts and whether the mitigation is sufficient, and whether they were removed, those contracts were ended to remove duplication and generate efficiencies.
Yes.
So thank you, Councillor. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but what we're looking at tonight is the process, not the whys and wherefores of the decision. So we're not looking at what the impacts of that decision would be. We're looking at, or you should be looking at, the process that the executive went through in terms of making that decision, and as said in the call-in, how that whether all alternatives are looked at. You're looking at the process where the alternatives looked at. You're not looking at what those alternatives are as part of this process. And in terms of the process of taking into account all relevant matters, you're looking at whether the executive did take into account all relevant matters, but not looking at what those relevant matters necessarily are in detail. So it's about process rather than the detail of the decision. That is what the calling process is here to do, is to look at how the decision was taken, not the detail around that decision, specifically those
Sure, the calling member can articulate that in their opinion, the impact of the loss of the service wasn't made. I think that's what they were about to do, was demonstrate in their opinion, quote, the impact of the loss of services.
Right. I'm keen that we actually get on with the subject matter that we're here to discuss. Councillor Lomas indicated.
Thank you, Chair. I think the relevant issue here is that the call-in request is about the decision that was made on the community contracts, the decision that was made at the October executive meeting. And when you look at what the monitoring officer has written in the call-in paper, it says, comments in relation to an expired contract, referring to the Age UK Day Clubs, because that was an expired contract, were not relevant to the proposed provisions outlined in the paper. So that is the monitoring officer's written viewpoint, that comments in relation to an expired contract, specifically the Age UK Day Clubs contract, which had expired at its ordinary end date, was not relevant to the proposed provisions outlined in the paper. So the Age UK Day Clubs contract is not relevant to the proposed provisions outlined in the paper, and therefore not a ground for calling. So if you continue to discuss it, then you're essentially saying that the monitoring officer is incorrect in his ruling. And I'm not sure how that can possibly stand, because you've had that ruling from the monitoring officer for some time now. It's not that that has just been said today in the meeting, it's in writing and we've all seen it.
I'm sure all members have read the monitoring officer's comments. What I didn't take that to mean, and maybe I'm alone here, is that we are as a committee being prevented from discussing what I consider to be relevant matters in relation to the grounds for calling that were upheld. And I'm not going to prolong this discussion and the debate. I find it very troubling that advice is being provided to us secondhand. No one's had the courtesy to brief me as chair around aspects of the paper that we are not allowed to, not being prevented from discussing. I find it really troubling, and I don't want to put you in a difficult position, Lindsay, because I know you are relaying information that you've been asked to pass on, but I find it deeply troubling. So, members, given the instruction we've been given,
Just a final point of order, because that's quite strong.
Well, I feel quite strongly about it.
I understand that, but the monitoring office comments were published with the papers 5 working days ago. So,
Please, Councillor.
so if there was any query about the interpretation whatsoever, because I think, as has been articulated by the Deputy Monitoring Officer, by other members of the committee, that it's all being read in a very clear way by everybody apart from the people who wish to talk about a particular contract. If there was any ambiguity, you had 5 working days to be able to seek any clarity that was required. And I think to then suggest to an officer who isn't present that they've in some way behaved in a way that's not appropriate is troubling, to use your own word.
I find it surprising that interpretation has been arrived at, because certainly I didn't interpret his comments as saying, and you may not speak about that aspect of the paper. I think what it was very clear is that, if any members made the point that due to the lack of public involvement, if members started to go down a line of argument relating to one of the grounds that's been deemed invalid, then yeah, obviously I would say, well, no, the monitoring officer said we can't, that's not a valid ground for calling. I didn't interpret it as saying, and because the Age UK Day Clubs contract was mentioned in relation to that ground, you can't talk about that service. But the ruling has been given. I don't know, Councillor Vassie, if you want to say anything, given the ruling that we've had from the monitoring officer.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Chair. When I said my comments are restricted to cutting funding to the Age UK Day Clubs, I was going to do that entirely in the context of the various points that have been made here, namely in item 2, it says the ASC 05 saving could have included some explanation of how the proposal either removed duplication or generated efficiencies. My contention is that efficiencies and duplications weren't considered. They weren't put before the executive. They're not in the paper. They're not in the ASC 05. Personally, I mean, I hear the comments about being party political. I would hope that most people around the table would see that I'm not hugely party political. And I would like to suggest that actually, I think most of us would start from the same premise, that we want services to benefit all the people in our community. That's where I'm coming from. And those are the comments I would seek to make, and all I would seek to do, and I'm not rehearsing what I've got down here at the moment, would be to set out why it is that I believe that evidence wasn't produced and put before the executive, either of duplication or of efficiency savings. And that indeed, as I understand it, is the whole grounds for this call-in, that those considerations were not made at the time that this budget saving was approved.
Thank you. So we now have up to 20 minutes for members of the committee to ask questions of the call-in members. Councillor Coles.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple of questions of clarification. I'm new to this call-in process, but I thought that the process didn't allow for call-ins relating to the budget processes. So I'm slightly confused about some of the comments that have been made around budget savings, when I thought budget savings were excluded from this process. I'm further, again, slightly confused by the way in which the call-in is being framed when the paper itself that went to the executive around this was around new procurement processes and a retendering of contracts that were ending. This is about looking at how we do things differently in the future based on changing the way we've done things in the past to fit the budget that was available. We could all sit here and decide that we want nothing to ever change, but actually...
Is there a question for me or for the colleague?
It's a point of clarification around the budget process,
Okay.
because that's what's being asked, and then it's a question around how this relates to the paper that went to the executive, because it doesn't make any sense to me.
On the first point, one of the grounds that has been ruled valid by the monetary officer is that the claim the decision was contrary to or not wholly consistent with the budget. So that's my interpretation, and maybe my interpretation will be way off all evening, but I think it's not unreasonable if you're claiming that the decision made at the October executive meeting was not wholly consistent with the budget. I think it's unreasonable to mention the budget. I don't know if councillors Vassy and Runciman want to respond to the other.
I'd just like to assure the member that if she thinks everything stays the same every year in the budget, she's very sadly mistaken. It changes every year according to demand, according to priorities of the administration at the time, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. And it also changes depending on how much money the government of the day decides to give. And one of the things that happened during this budget was the extra money that came in to adult social care and how that was to be spent. And that was quite a significant factor.
Yes, yeah.
So just on the basis that, of course, you would expect services to reflect budget setting and community demands, why is it then that these contracts hadn't been retendered for 7 years? They've just been rolled over and rolled over and rolled over. That is things never being changed.
If we thought that they were in need of change, then we would have changed them during our tenure. If we didn't, if we thought they were giving a good service then we wouldn't change them, and that's obvious. I can't think what the problem is really. You stop things that aren't doing well, and the budget priorities are set by the demands of the public. They're not set by what the executive member or the officers think. It's what the public needs and what the public wants. That's where you start from.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thank you. In some respects, Councillor Coles has picked up one of the points that I wanted to raise. I'm a little bit confused that on the one hand, the budget changes every year, and so therefore everything changes every year and nothing stands still. And then at the other hand, actually the money in the budget doesn't have any relevance to the setting of things, and we're quite happy to roll things over since 2017 consistently. That seems to be nonsensical. The other thing within the call-in that seemed to me to be a little bit nonsensical was the suggestion that we could just have a 10% reduction across all contracts. You were the exec member for 8 years. You will know how close to statutory minimum all of our services are in adult social care. So if we were to just take 10% out of all of these budgets, how many of them do you think would dip below statutory minimum service levels?
Right, 2 questions I'll try to address. I didn't say everything stays the same every year. Some things certainly do, and some things don't. And I think I implied that in what I said previously. 10% off had to be an option. When you get options, I'm sure you know this, the 2 that you always have is that everything stays the same or that you stop everything. They're the 2 extremes. And then in between those 2 extremes, you have all sorts of different options, like cutting 10% off everything. I'm not saying that cutting 10% off of everything was a good idea or a bad idea. It's certainly an option, and it wasn't considered in the papers.
Thank you. Do you want to add something, Councillor Vassey?
Yes, thank you. I'd just go back to what I said earlier. What is an issue for me is that the savings proposal refers specifically to a review of community contracts to remove duplication and generate efficiencies in services. And from my perspective, it would seem common sense that that review should take place prior to a decision being made so that it's an informed decision. And while I'm not talking about the things that I have found difficult with regard to a particular contract, what I have learned through that process and from talking to people who provide those community services is that there doesn't appear to have been any discussion prior to these decisions being made with regard to the issue of duplication and efficiency. And if there had been, I suspect a variety of solutions might have presented themselves that would have given the executive more options when deciding what to do. And that's my issue with this, is that I suspect that information wasn't provided, decisions were made, and the fallout has been considerable. Regardless of where we stand, I take on board that we're not allowed to talk about the public and so on and so forth, but it seems to me common sense that before the decision was made, that review should have happened.
Councillor Rose.
Thank you. I mean, I put my hand up for a question about the 10% anyway, but I'll treat a supplementary question to this, which is, we know that there are contracts where applying a 10% reduction would take it below the legal minimum. I'd just like to ask, was it 8 years as the exec member, how many times you got presented an unlawful option on a paper by officers? Because I don't think it does happen, at least not in my limited experience.
Yes, I take on board your limited experience, Councillor Rose, but I have to say, if you're going to be presented with options after a review, and I absolutely agree with Councillor Vassey, there should have been a review, it should have given all options, gone to exec to make a decision, then 10% would have been one of them. They might have put, if they were officers writing the report, you could take 10% off everything, but it would be illegal, or said so. But if you're looking at all the options, that's one of them, as is doing nothing, as is removing everything. They're all options. Some of them are very unwise, but they're nevertheless options.
You've got a follow on?
Yes, I just want to clarify that you would expect that in all exec papers and decisions, and if we go back, that would be the norm, be that we would have something that says option C, here's some text brackets, this isn't an option. Because it seems really strange to me to make that argument. I get in there, there's also other things like cutting some more than others, which would be lawful, but that specific one just seems contrary to everything I've seen on papers.
Well, keep trying, Councillor Rose. If I didn't have it in the papers, I would certainly have it in the briefing. And then, you know, quite often, oh, stop waving your hand about, Councillor Crawshaw, very distracting. Then, they've got me doing it now. Then I would expect the briefing from the officer to say, you could do this, but that would be very unwise, or it would be illegal or whatever. But I wouldn't count anything out until it had been properly discussed, and then the ones that could go forward to the executive after the review would go forward.
Is that supplementary, Councillor Eyre?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm restricting the temptation to talk about percentage cuts to explore, which might be illegal, and the fact that that's been done and was presented and passed in the budget. But obviously trying to focus on this 10% distracts, and going back to the original question from Councillor Crawshaw, which was which of these services could survive on less than 10%? And I appreciate that. Would you agree that, for example, things like the Up Mind project that commissions a set number of hours of counselling, for example, could be done for 10% less? And also reflecting on Councillor Crawshaw's comments about what would that impact of 10% be? What would the impact of 100% cuts be to some of those services?
Councillor Vassy?
I'd just add that if one is reviewing things, it's surely a basic principle to talk to the other party to find out what it is they're doing, how they think they're doing it, how things might be made more efficient prior to making the decision, rather than saying, we will make efficiency savings and that will be that. And again, I just say, I've not seen the evidence that a discussion took place between the parties. I'm only familiar with one of these. I know, and I take it on board, that there are a number of different contracts involved. But in the one I'm familiar with, I've not seen evidence that the council sat down with the service provider to look at issues of duplication or efficiencies. And that's the critical thing, because if we see all these outside bodies as our friends in the city, rather than our competitors or whatever, surely having that strong relationship, being able to talk frankly, go through the issues, is key to good decision making.
Thank you. So I've got a few hands up. I'll take people who haven't spoken yet. Councillor Widdowson.
Just ask you to, you have to excuse the voice, it's a bit ropey this week. What I'm hearing from both of you is that you're looking for the evidence that there was a review, so that then the understanding of how the decision was made could be understood, could be agreed. We can agree or not with the decision at the end, but we can understand the process, understand the criteria, understand the methodology, and that's the crux of what you're asking.
Thank you, Councillor Widdowson. That's absolutely right.
And it's not simply about the council, it's also about those people providing services to the council so that they can feel comfortable that due process has taken place, that issues of duplication and efficiency have been considered properly in the round.
Councillor Merritt, you indicated earlier. Okay. Councillor Coles.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on Councillor Vassy's point around the review of contracts and duplication and efficiency savings, because my understanding of this whole process is that's what it was about. And the whole reason that was having to take place in the way that it was because it hadn't happened before. There have been dozens of contracts in adult social care that had been rolled over and over and over and hadn't been looked at for years. And actually, if you don't look at these contracts regularly, that is how you end up in a position where you are completely overspent on your budgets and you have to make harder decisions about that. And I would also come back to, I feel really
Is there a question?
Yes, it's whether or not this is a genuine process, because actually we have been in these positions with other procurement processes and there has been no call-in.
Can I reply? Have we run out of time?
No.
Okay, absolutely not. We were concerned about this from way back. And I think you'll find that we have actually said that several times. Nothing to do with what's going on at the moment in a by-election, nothing whatsoever. I'm sure that Councillor Eyre will want to respond.
Councillor Vassy.
Members will all, I imagine, remember that I raised this issue at full council long before any of this was discussed. I've raised the issue in the media about 8 or 9 weeks ago. I've raised it earlier in the year when rehearsing, and I won't go over it all again, the situation that my father found himself in. So these are not issues that suddenly pop up for opportunistic reasons. I would hope that it was possible that we could agree to discuss the issue at face value and not become burdened by it. In the end, a by-election will come and a by-election will go. The situation will remain. And I've yet to hear, I'm interested to hear what you say, Councillor Cole, but I've yet to hear anyone give me any evidence that these issues were considered prior to decisions being made. And that's the bone of contention for me.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little bit confused because you keep referring back to the budget, and the point of a call-in is that you can't go back to the evidence base that went behind a decision within the budget. The decision was made to go down a particular route, and so that was the decision that full council made, and you can oppose it, and you did oppose it, but that then is not subject to the call-in process. So the call-in is on this specific question from the 10th of October and on this specific re-procurement or new procurement of 2 new contracts. And I just want to understand really clearly from Councillor Runciman, because you said something in response to a question earlier, which I think is pertinent to this. So we were talking about the various different options that might be available, and you thought that 10% cut should be one of the options, and presumably by extension 25% and 50% could equally be, we could choose any of those options. You then said that you would expect to be having the discussions in pre-briefings before any of these papers were put together about all of that range of options, and then a reasonable selection of options be brought forward. And there are 3 options in this paper, aren't there? There's one that is the option that was taken, and there's one that was the sort of the extreme, as you said, which was no services, and I don't think any of us would want that. And there's another option in there as well, which is a collaborative one. I presume that you would expect that a range of other options, as would have been done when you were the exec member, have been discussed with the exec member and have been deemed to be not sufficient to bring forward as an option within this paper that comes to executive. Would that be correct?
It could be. I've worked with a lot of directors of adult social services. They don't all work in the same way, but they always talk everything, they always have talked everything through with me, as I would hope happens with the present executive member. I think you're getting into very tortuous waters, and I really can't see the point of what you're saying. I'm sure you can. I don't think I want to be asked again, thank you very much. But I think that several options should be put forward. There were only 3, which is quite a low number, actually. But that was the decision that was taken. Obviously, I wasn't involved in it.
Right, we're nearly, time's nearly up. Any final questions? Councillor Ben Burton.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Put my hand up and I'm losing track of life for a second here. I guess what the key question here is that this report is, as Councillor Crawshaw has just said, in relation to 2 specific contracts, and that's the questions being raised. We'll get on to whether or not that's what was being discussed in the briefings, rather than the contracts that haven't been renewed. I guess when in your time as an exec member, did you always take decisions for contracts that have come to an end? Or have you been in situations where a contract has come to an end and that's just accepted that a contract has run to the end of its procurement?
In my time as executive member, the matter of a contract that was going to end would always be discussed with me. It wouldn't suddenly have ended.
But it'd be discussed with you, but would it come to an executive decision?
It would have to be discussed with me, and then we would decide whether it would be renewed or whether it wouldn't be renewed or whatever. It wouldn't be a last minute thing. It shouldn't come as a surprise to an executive member.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of this section of the meeting. So if I can ask Councillors Runciman and Vassie to retire to the public gallery, please. So the next stage is for the executive members to respond to the alleged breaches raised by the call-in members, and you will have up to 10 minutes. I'll leave you to decide how you want to divvy the time up. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for that discussion. I do welcome the Liberal Democrats drawing attention to our commissioning of these important services that will support people's independence and them remaining in their own homes. This report sought approval for 2 separate services, one for advice and information to be delivered to service users and their families and carers, and one for another service to support our residents' independence. In tendering these services, we reflect the Council's plan and commitment to health and wellbeing focus and on being a health generating city for all our residents, regardless of age. In York, over the 20-year period to 2040, we know that there will be an increase of around 1/3 of people needing care, and in turn, people providing care increasing by 1/4, and those living with dementia by almost 50%. These increases of an ageing population will continue to challenge an already stretched system. The Council Plan One City for All sets out ambitions for people to live healthy and fulfilling lives by reducing health inequalities and improving people's health and well-being. Good accessible information is essential to help people live fulfilling lives and play a part in their communities. The 10-year Joint Health and Wellbeing Strategy 2022 sets out their 10 big goals, one of which highlights our adult social services, prioritising a home first model. This home first model supports and recognises the benefits of keeping people in their own home and offering people a resident-centred approach, and provides the services that work for people and their families. Not having these types of services risks adding costly pressures to services already doing their very best to address social care needs of our adult residents. Commissioning services that support people within their communities at the earliest stage of need is absolutely the right approach for the Council. This supports people to maintain independence for as long as possible and prevents delays for the need for more significant and costly interventions from statutory adult social care services. The commissioning of these 2 services fulfills the Council's Care Act responsibility. So regarding section 2 of the call-in, under the saving agreed being to remove duplication and generate efficiencies in services and agreements being made to allow contracts that have reached the end of their commission period to conclude. The agreed savings were to remove duplication and generate efficiencies in services. The agreed savings under community contracts are part of an overall review of commission services, which come under this umbrella, such as homelessness, advocacy, dementia services, some of which have already come to executive for agreement, and some of these are still part of the ongoing review for all contracts. Some examples of this are the Changing Lives Homelessness and Resettlement Pathways in May 24, the Advocacy Hub in September 24, and the Community Dementia in October 24. The independent care group that's referenced in the call-in paper in the first part is a care association. Most councils do have a care association, and York is not unique in this. Independent care groups provide a service to every care service that they represent and negotiate with the council on fee rates. It was therefore a conflict of interest to continue to fund them. Care groups are not local authority services to fund. Contracts were considered individually and sequentially based on their renewal date, rather than looking at all contracts at the same time, which would have been incredibly resource heavy. The purpose of this executive report was not to cover all commission contracts, but to how adult social care contracts can support the Care Act 2014. Part 1, Section 2 discusses the preventing care needs support and preventing delays and reducing the needs of adults with support needs and their carers. And Section 4 explains the advice and information that's not general community provision. The review of what was happening in communities and other resources available to reduce duplication with very limited resources. Examples of duplication within previous contracts are within the Family Wellbeing Service, with a large amount of work could be undertaken within the other areas and with other services such as local area coordinators, the wellbeing and mind teams in schools and housing services. The report also looks at what was being delivered by other funding services. As we've previously said, many of the contracts started in 2017 and should have been reviewed in 2020, but had extensions and waivers applied, which did not take into account the needs of our community, that many of these communities and the people within them may have had significant changes around them. I'll move on to Section 4A of the call-in now, which states the paper has not set out all options and alternatives and states community contracts total several million, and savings agreed represent 275,000 of this. The call-in also states that the only option presented is to retender one version of a scaled-back set of community contracts or not to retender and lose all the services. This is not the case and confuses the decisions arising from the executive report. When looking at alternatives, there's many options that are considered before arriving at the recommendation proposals. These are wide-ranging and many are not taken forward. Further work being completed, not taken forward due to them not being feasible or them having financial constraints. This call-in seems to be stating all discussions and developments need to be within the final report, which is not practical or necessary. The officers present decisions to the executive and fully explain the implications, and executive make the decision as to what is taken forward within this and what will be the most effective. There's already been some discussion around applying a 10% reduction to all contracts, and applying this 10% reduction is not an approach that we want to move forward to taking. Salami slicing risks making them ineffective, and instead, and in some cases, we are commissioning and recommissioning services to ensure they target our resources for maximum benefit. Because we're moving closer and closer to providing statutory-only services in adult social care, something imposed on us due to sustained real-term reduction in council funding, we have to be focused on the need and move away from rolling over contracts without questioning their present-day value. There was no expectation of a report detailing all contracts returning to executive, as the decision was made by full council in February 2024. Regarding the savings to be made, and the budget decisions are not subject to call-in under the council's constitution. So regarding Section 4C, final part of the call-in, it states there was no reference in the paper to the totality of contracts within the review. this wasn't the purpose of the report, nor should it have been. An exercise was undertaken to establish a new base to reflect the council's commitments that reflect the council's plan and objectives to deliver the remaining saving. The objective was to ensure the council continues delivering high quality provision that meets the population's need. The call-in states there's no reference to the mine contract, Yorkshire Housing or community links, which make up the bulk of the saving. Again, none of this was within the scope of the executive report. I take on board the points raised about the interim external service provision and its contract funding commitment prior to the start of the new contracts, and I'm happy to work with officers to expand the detail provided in the reports. But when a contract ends, there's no requirement for a decision, an approval decision. Approval's only needed when procuring a new contract. Not every contract has been reviewed, as not every contract has been due for renewal within the financial year. The Advocacy Hub paper covers some of what Mind delivers, and we are working with the ICB to consider the rest of the contracts with each organisation we have with York Mind. The current York Carers Centre contract, the information and advice contract had a total value of 402,000 per annum since the 1st of April, supported by the Better Care Fund, and there's been an uplift agreed on this, which will take this year, which is in the York Carers Centre contract. Yeah, and so that is it. If you'd like to speak, I hope I didn't change you.
Okay, no, you're bang on time. Thank you very much. So, members, we have up to 20 minutes for questions to be posed to the executive members. Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and coming to the issue about the totality of the contracts, which I think is absolutely valid, because the paper refers to commissioning of 100,000 and 127,000. Those two figures don't come from nowhere. They're the balancing figure of what's left at the end of all those contracts. So my question to you is, what was the total value of the contracts that were part of this review, and what was the total saving delivered from that?
So officers are able to join us at the table if any technical questions need to be answered. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Story. I'm the Corporate Director of Adult Social Care and Integration, and I hold the role of Statutory Director of Adult Services. Hi. So I do have a summary sheet of all of the contracts that have been listed with the 23-24 values, the 24-25 commitments, and the 25-26 commitments. So I'm just going to see if I can find the totals for these at the bottom. It's hopefully on a spreadsheet. So the total value of the 23-24 commitments is 1,853,786. The 24-25 commitments, 1,453,159. And the 25-26 commitments, 1,403,348. So that constitutes a reduction from last year to this year of £400,628 and a reduction next year of £49,811. So just in terms of the summary of those changes, just find my paper, 1 second. So the saving achieved 24-25 was 264,000. So that was the saving approved by full council prior to the start of the financial year, and the saving commitment for 25-26 was 75,000. Other decisions in year, so a community links contract cessation was agreed by Children's DMT, that's departmental management team, as they agreed that it wasn't required to be continued. And there were some contract variations due to some unfunded budgets. the Yorkshire housing contract was actually handed back, so that service didn't continue. That was handed back prior to my starting, so I wasn't here for the start of that piece of work. In terms of the contracts that have continued, so executive did receive a paper on the 9th of May for sensory services. Homelessness provision with changing lives was considered on the 9th of May. Sensory services was considered on the 14th of April. Advocacy services on the 12th of September, and the dementia community model on the 10th of October. So obviously the financial commitment for each of those papers was detailed in each of those reports.
Okay.
Okay.
Supplementary, Councillor Ryan.
Thank you, Sal. Thank you for the figures, and I've done the calculations. So I'll then ask the executive member, given that the saving required for 2 years, not just this year and next year, was 339,000. Why cut 450,000, 111,000 more than was actually required by the budget? That 111,000 could have gone into some more of these contracts. Why did you choose to deliver £110,000 more cuts to these particular contracts than were necessary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll take this one. As Councillor Eyre will no doubt know from his years of doing the executive member for finance role, adult social care in particular is an area where demand inflation is an extreme pressure on budgets. And so where we have the opportunity to restructure services and to deliver savings that allow for some headroom for providing the direct support to some of the most people with the most complex needs in our communities, then that's the right thing to do. I think what we have seen in adult social care in the current financial year is those demand and cost inflationary pressures continuing, and us continuing to find ways to deliver the statutory services that people need within our budget envelope. And that does mean changes. Councillor Runciman said just earlier in her presentation that things change every year, and they absolutely do. And so all of our officers work really hard to find ways to continue to deliver services within their budget envelope in every way that they can.
Just a final point on that to Councillor Steels-Walshaw, would you then agree, because this is about process, that should have been mentioned in the report, and an option should have been to re-procure everything that was in there, not siphon £111,000 off? That's absolutely fine for you to make that decision that Councillor Lomas has said that she made. But should that have not been an option in the paper, option 4, to say, well, actually, we don't need to take the extra 111,000. We've saved the 339. We're going to retender 210,000 for advice and information.
But we're unable to do that if it takes us over the budget.
But we just discussed it doesn't take over the budget. The budget saving is 339. You delivered 400,000 of savings of the 339 in 24-25 alone. So you did.
Conscious
I
not
think,
getting into.
Councillor, I already answered that question by explaining that not every piece of expenditure fits neatly into the budget line that it first gets allocated in. And where we have significant demand and inflationary cost pressures on adult social care, there is a requirement in year to make changes to the way we deliver services where we can to remain within the budget envelope for adult social care. And that is exactly what our very diligent and skilled officers are doing day in, day out, as you very well know.
Councillor Coles.
Thank you, Chair. And I had a question for the exec member around, I think it was item 2 of the call-in, around the duplication and generating efficiencies point. And I just wanted to ask kind of if she can enlighten us a little bit more around the process of that, particularly given the demand pressures that we know that there are, both in terms of the budget itself, but also in terms of adult social care demand and complexity of needs. Just what the kinds of processes that you were going through, the questions you were asking during that process in order to try and ensure that we were getting the most efficient savings and procurements that we could out of these services when they hadn't been procured for so many years. I assume it was just helpful, I think, just in terms of that particular item to understand what that process was from your point of view, so that we can inform our decision.
So I think within that, when we're looking at the so within that comes under the duplication, and within looking at the duplication within it wasn't just duplication within the council, it's duplication with it across the whole of communities, and looking what was available to people, what was around to people, and within that, as I have previously mentioned, looking at how communities have changed. Not all communities have stayed the same. Very often people within those communities have moved, changed, they're very different. So looking at what other services were already available and what was procured and what could be provided to people within that, and what was available around offering support to families, people and their carers.
Thank you. Councillor Widdowson.
Councillor Coles, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because that was one of the questions that I was going to be asking. And I'm really pleased, Councillor, to hear the response. Why was that not in the paper? Why was it not written down and shown up, and then we wouldn't be here? That's all that the calling is asking for, is where is the evidence? Where is the process that you made those decisions by? Because if we had that openness, transparency and understanding, we could all be at home watching whatever we want to watch, Rivals or whatever it is on the telly at the moment.
I think when looking at these sorts of papers, it's really absolutely everything that is discussed cannot be added to the papers. And it's really, it's tricky to see all those things that are possibly discounted to begin with, or to see or to understand that when talking about the duplication, that it was looked about that that it wasn't duplication throughout the whole of the community. Is that what you mean? And that it wasn't, that it was duplication within community and council contracts?
Just following on there, we've got a report that's 173 pages long. Surely at some point there could have been something in there that put that review. A couple of tables that said, this is being done by whatever group, this is not being done by whatever group, this is how we came to the decision. This is opaque. And that's the reason that we're all sat around the table. It isn't a sensible, clear, transparent process that you make a decision by. Whether you've made the right or wrong decision, I can't say, because I don't have the evidence.
If I can just respond quickly here. I think, as we established during earlier questions for Councillor Runciman, not everything that gets discussed with executive members goes into the final papers. They would be significantly longer than they currently are if it did. And I know it's difficult when you're no longer in the executive and you're no longer in those rooms getting those briefings. And it must be frustrating that you don't get that level of detail and you don't get that first pass to you know, direct the decision making to your priorities. But that's the nature of politics. And it is very clear that this call-in always would have happened, because the call-in specifically was so that you could discuss a specific contract that's been ruled out of order in terms of the grounds for calling. That's what you wanted to do. Councillor Vassy was quite clear that that's all he wanted to do, and that's the only reason why he was here. So this calling would have happened, whatever, you would have found a way to come here to try to talk about that. It's nothing to do with opaqueness in papers. The papers are very detailed about the services being commissioned. The paper was not intended to be a review of all contracts and a review of all services, nor was it intended to be a description of adherence to budget or not adherence to budget overall by adult social care. So I think that Councillor Steels-Walshaw has explained that she had full briefings on elements of duplication and efficiencies, that she had discussion of various different options before the paper came to be put forward. And I'm sorry, but you can't say that we wouldn't be here if that report had been double the length and had included those things, because you still would have called it in to try and talk about that contract.
For what it's worth, I'll remind members what I said at the beginning of the meeting about this being inquisitorial rather than adversarial. Maybe that ship has sailed. Councillor Crawshaw.
That's a slight understatement there, but I did enjoy it. I just was hoping that perhaps touching back on some of the discussion that was had around options and options that are brought forward. I think you've already sort of alluded to it to some degree anyway, but if you could just confirm that in the briefings with the relevant officers, you do explore more than the 3 options that have been brought forward in this paper. And I also wonder, it was alluded that you know, no information is ever shared with any of the other political groups about any of these difficult decisions. And I think, you know, it is probably stating the obvious, but I don't think any of us wish to be in a position that we are all in, actually, of having no money to spend on services that we would all like to see in you know, expanded rather than reduced and all that sort of thing. But if you could just give us a précis of any information that was shared with other groups, either as a result of this paper being published or at any points, you know, before, during, after as well.
So, as you have discussed to begin with, looking at the alternatives when discussing with officers, there's loads of alternatives that are discussed before coming to a recommendation process. Really wide ranging, and many of these won't be taken forwards. Many of the, and as it happens, the ones to look at for the impact are placed in the report at the end. Regarding, sorry, can you repeat the second part of your question, Councillor?
Well, it was sort of inferred previously that no information is shared with anybody outside of the executive or the decision makers, and my experience as a non-executive member when in opposition was that actually, generally speaking, if you asked for information from officers, you could usually get quite a lot of factual information, maybe not everything that you wanted. But if you could give us a summary of any information that was either requested or shared as a result of this paper having been put forward.
Sorry, Tim. I believe there was information requested prior to the executive meeting of the officers from the Liberal Democrats, which was discussed, and answers were given regarding this paper. And it's about, and if you were wanting, I'm not sure if you're wanting information on the papers that have already been, that shown information that was discussing around the contract, because there's the Advocacy Hub paper, which covers some of what, because this mentions some of Mind, and that covers some of what Mind delivers. I'm working with the ICB in order for that to take place.
I think you have a supplementary, then I'll bring you back to cover anything else.
I think that's actually what my question was about, because Councillor Sells, well, so a lot of this is about trust, and you're asking us to trust that you had these briefings, you had this information, etc., which is why Councillor Widdowson was correct. It should have been in the paper, makes it easier. But in terms of reassuring us, so you said at the beginning, and you said then again, that the advocacy contract covers some of what Mind delivers. Can you outline what you understand in the advocacy contract is something that York Mind deliver? And then furthermore, what your understanding of the York Mind services that were under review? Because I don't believe anything in the advocacy contract is, as you quote, something that's covered by what Mind already does in terms of duplication.
Sorry, say that again.
So you said the advocacy contract that's going out covers some of what Mind deliver. You've repeated that again.
Yeah.
That some of what Mind deliver has been recommissioned in the advocacy contract. What is your understanding that's in the advocacy contract is something that is duplicated in what Mind was previously delivering? So if it helps, that you ended the York Mind Spartacus, you ended the York Mind one-to-one, and you're saying some of that is covered in the advocacy contract. What parts of the advocacy contract cover those services that you've said were duplicated?
So there's still wellbeing in mind services in school. Are you asking what that was duplicating
No, you,
for?
you said that when the advocacy contract was re-tendered,
Mhm.
that covered some of the services that York Mind were already providing. So what in the advocacy contract that you've just tendered has replaced what York Mind were providing in the contracts that ended?
In the advocacy contract?
That's, the question was what the executive member understands, so you can't really tell me what the executive member understands. I know what the advocacy contract provides, I know what York Mind provide, I was checking that the executive
Well,
member.
you're either asking a technical question or you're asking a gotcha
Yeah.
question.
The question was, what did the executive member understand?
If Sarah wants to come and provide some, please do join us and answer a technical question in terms of the scope of the contract.
So apologies, I can't necessarily remember the detail of all papers we brought through, so I've just double checked, and the York Mind currently provide the current advocacy hub contract, which is council contribution of £396,437 from us and £52,009 from the ICB. Those contracts, because they were due to come to an end, have been recommissioned as part of the advocacy paper that came to executive. So I guess.
My point, so I know that that's the IMCA contract and the NHS complaints advocacy contracts and the learning disability, so that's all the advocacy contracts.
Yeah.
The executive member said that parts of that advocacy contract are covering the York Mind Spartacus and York Mind one-to-one contracts, which were allowed to end in September. I don't think, and I think you can confirm to me, that nothing in the advocacy contract duplicates what was.
Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you, executive members for responding. We now have an opportunity for the calling in members. I have up to 5 minutes to make any concluding remarks they wish to. So I will invite councillors Runciman and Bassey to rejoin us at the table. So you have up to 5 minutes. Don't feel obliged to use all of the 5 minutes, but in your own time.
Thank you, Chair. We all know that some residents have been distressed by the ending of some of these contracts. Transparency is very important, as the committee has heard, especially in decision-making where residents are quite seriously affected. It's quite clear that removing duplication was not explored fully and generating efficiencies was not explored fully. And both of those things should have happened. More options also should have been put in the public domain, not just the 3 that were. It seems to us that a review should have taken place. That review should have been a public paper, and it should have gone to the executive to consider very carefully with all the implications of what might happen and what would affect residents if contracts were ended. We feel the call-in is valid. We can assure members that the happenings outside this room at this time are absolutely nothing to do with it. It's residents first for us, and it always will be. Thank you.
Why don't you think, Councillor Bassey?
Thank you, Chair. I'd first of all because all this party political stuff irritates me a little, I have to say, just point out that the York Central's MP has also expressed concerns about this. It's not party political. The concern has come from all sides. Unless someone wants to tell me that wasn't in the press. But so, second point. If I could just finish.
We were told not to, we were asked not to mention specific contracts, and I think members of the most part managed to do that. But if I can ask people to stay with the generality, given the instruction we've been given by the monitoring officer. Thank you.
We've heard several times that the contracts hadn't been reviewed since 2017 and that they should have, and they were overdue for review. I agree. I don't have a problem with that. My issue is when we said we all agree there should have been a review, there appeared not to have been a review before the decisions were made. And that's what concerns me. My last point is that, and people say, well, I'm just obsessed with one issue, and that's where I'm coming from. I'm referring to that one because that's the one I'm most familiar with. That's why the points I've made have related to that. And that is what has led me to believe that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what services are being provided in certain instances. And I think that was brought out in the discussion since then, when questions were asked about what services were being provided by this contract or that. I certainly know from my own research and my discussions with one particular service provider that the understanding around the table as to what services were being provided does not appear to tally with the services that were being provided. And that's critical because if one's talking about duplication or efficiency, it has to be a precondition that all parties know and agree what the issues are, what the services are that are being provided. And that's why the openness and transparency are important. And I can only repeat again, and hope that someone will hear this, I am not being hugely party political in this. I'm not interested in that. My interest in this particular issue stems from my personal knowledge gained from having been involved in one of the particular areas that this applies to, which brings a different kind of understanding. That's why I'm at the table. I hope going forwards that regardless of what happens right now, there is an agreement and consensus that when this process takes place again, it is understood and a given that the more openness there is, the more opportunity there is for parties to input. And I don't mean political parties, I mean service providers, I mean the politics, the council, all the different groups. The more opportunity there is for input, the better the decision making will be. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. You may return to the public gallery. So I'll now invite Councillors Steele Walshaw and Lomas. You have up to 5 minutes for any concluding remarks you would like to make.
Thank you, Chair. So I am satisfied that the questions around these contracts were asked and explored in the officers' pre-meets. I'm satisfied that everything was asked of officers and that I had enough information and that there was enough information provided to make these decisions. We cannot keep everything the same. As highlighted in the opening of this, communities change, people's needs change, and the council needs to adapt to meet those changing needs. That doesn't just need to be people who are receiving council services. There's many, many services out there that can benefit people and that can change and support things for them and their families and their carers. The discussion was about commissioning services that officers recommend, and as Councillor Lomas says, officers do work incredibly hard and are trusted to look at and make these decisions, which we then look at and decide to present the decisions, which we then decide which of these will be taken forward. And above all for this, I think it was ultimately about providing high quality provision to meet the needs of vulnerable people. Thank you.
Thank you. So, members, we now enter the stage of the meeting where I will invite members to make any contributions they wish to make before the vote is taken, and you each have up to 5 minutes to make any contributions. So can I see indications of Councillor Ben Burton?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion tonight about lots of different things. I think start by saying I do have sympathy in terms of the challenges about, as actually mentioned by Councillor Runciman, when a contract comes to the end of its decision, there doesn't need to be a formal executive decision to make that decision, it just comes to the end of a contract, and that's clearly something that's happened previously under other administrations, and that's what happens. So I have some sympathy that that doesn't create great transparency. But the purpose of executive for officers a lot of the time is that it's there to make business decisions that can't go forwards without that decision to be made. So clearly what's been needed to done here is to re-tender 2 contracts. There needed to be an approval from executive, and that's what officers have brought forward for a request on those 2 specific contracts. The actual report perfectly sets out the reasoning behind those 2 specific contracts and why they're being re-tendered and what that process is going to be. So that's completely fine. I don't think there's an issue in there in terms of how the content of that report is written. So I don't see there being an issue. In fact, we've been shown today that these things that were being asked about for wider contracts have actually gone to other decision-making sessions in various different forms. So they are being considered. You're just wanting a report that covers everything, but that's not the purpose of that executive report. Maybe there'd be some benefits in doing that at times, and maybe there's something to take away for officers in terms of thinking about, do they need to provide a wider strategic fit for how this works in terms of how they're preventing options? But that isn't what the executive was being asked on that occasion. And that's not required. If I wanted to previously write in these reports, doing housing development in one place, I wouldn't put in an option about why we're not doing another completely unrelated housing development in another location. That's not what I'd have written an executive report for, because that's not the purpose of that report. So I think I understand some of the concerns that have been raised, but I don't think in this position that I feel that the report kind of meets that ground for the issues that have been raised personally, would be my view.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Coles.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple of observations from the discussion. I found some of the questions on the detail from Councillor Eyre slightly odd, because Councillor Eyre sits on the executive that made these decisions and had opportunities to ask these questions in that executive decision session. So and gets briefing before that executive decision meeting if he wants it. So I'm just confused as to why those questions were being raised in a procedural meeting here. My time in the executive, none of my papers that were decision papers were called in, and therefore I struggle to think that there is anything in any of this that isn't political, and I'm afraid, and I think it's really disappointing to see council processes being used in that way, because transparency is really important. And I know how hard officers and the voluntary and community sector are working across the city to try and deliver services differently, to try and make sure that we serve the vulnerable people in the city to the best of our abilities. And having to do that with difficult and challenging budgets is something that no one wants to be doing. And yet we do still have to try and do that in order to retain control of our council budget. I have complete faith in officers and the voluntary sector in the work that they're doing, and in the robustness of the papers that we were presented with here. I think that the procurement processes are difficult, but they were really long overdue. You know, I kind of, when I look at the procurement processes, I kind of think, you know, if I'd had a mobile phone contract for 7 years, I think my needs as a customer of a mobile phone contract might have changed over that time, and I might want to have the latest iPhone with all the free minutes and texts that I could possibly never need. But actually, I might not be able to afford that. And actually, that is the reality of where we are. We cannot afford what we might have wanted 7 years ago. We just can't afford it. So we have to do things differently. And I think that it is sad to think that our council processes are now being exploited because there's a political opportunity in the form of a by-election that is taking place, and that's then been used to try and undermine a process that officers work extremely hard on. And I think it's therefore, I don't see anything in this call-in that isn't being used politically, and I think it's really disappointing.
Thank you. Councillor Widdowson.
Councillor Coles, I feel like I'm going to be echoing you all night. I'm extremely disappointed by your position on trying to make it party political. So the reason for the call-in, and I agree with some of what the previous councillor said, I can't read your name from there, and apologies. Some of what you've said is that some of the details in there, but we were looking at a whole range of contracts. And it would have been a simple matter to put a couple of tables together to say, this one is covered by this one, which is why we've made this decision. This one isn't covered by this one. That's why we've grown, because some of the contracts have grown the spend. That was the basis for the calling, to have more evidence, more openness and transparency, so that the public could understand how we made the decision, rather than it feel like it's just been done, which I'm sure was not the case. But it's only looking for that evidence. And that's why I keep going back to, that's why it was called in. If it was open, it was transparent, and we had the evidence with the information in front of us, we wouldn't be sat here.
Thank you, Councillor Rose.
Thanks. I certainly don't think it is purely political, and apologies if that's what it sounded like I implied earlier. I do think that those who called it in have had concerns about this issue since before the Budget Council. And their issue is with the decision in the budget and things that they quote wouldn't have cut in that budget. I don't disagree with the chair that the budget decision can't be called in, but that the implementation can if it's not aligned. That's what reason 2 is for. And I empathise and have considered the fact that the amount saved here was more than the originally outlined amount at Budget Council, but my opinion is that this is in line with the overall budget. I haven't seen any officer comments to the contrary on that point at any point, so I don't agree with reason 2. There could have been an extra bullet stating what that deviation is, but I don't think that's in any way critical to the decision being made. I do think some of the comments here, the phrasing in the call and request form, the speeches tonight were intentionally political. I think the timing is relatively coincidental. It's when the exec decision happens to be. I don't think the resignation of a councillor was timed around that exec meeting. But I don't like having a politically charged meeting like this during the pre-election period, as I said in July when we had scrutinies that were similar. And the monitoring officer's advice was that comments related to expired contracts aren't relevant to this paper. People tonight have nonetheless made those comments, whether politically or otherwise. I think there is some validity in the point around how we should do reviews. For instance, we could discuss doing a top to bottom complete review of every single service and contract in totality for duplication, efficiency, and then lay out a multi-year path ahead for every single expiry that's coming up at some point. But that's not how we have done things in the past. There was a review for this. There were decisions around tendering services here. They were typical decisions with a range of valid options. The same decisions for other contracts since February's budget weren't called in. We could always put in more content. We could always take stuff out to make it clearer. I think as has been said, these papers are always a bit opaque and also a bit packed with information. So this doesn't feel atypical to any other paper that I've seen in my time here. And ditto for the point that has been made around when things need to be a decision or don't. And for those reasons, I don't agree with reason 4C, but I do think some of those can be discussed in other committees if we think that there is a broader concern around what we, or even just a way of improving what we put into these things. And then on 4AI, I don't believe the flat 10% was a valid or even legal option. And we have heard confirmation that past administrations didn't put every single conceivable option in the decision papers. I ran out of time, obviously, for 20 minutes to validate it, but I do think that exec members and officers frequently talk about what the statutory minimums are for our services, probably talk about it too much for any of our liking. You can't put every single 73% or 72.8% option in there. So they're whittled down to valid options. I think 3 options is reasonable. The budget consultation was wide with the public. Third parties engaged during the tendering process to make sure it's fair. The question for testing 4AI for me is, do I think that other options were eliminated ahead of the meeting? Do I think officers presented the best options? I think our officers are competent. Evidently, all the way before budget was first consulted on, before Budget Council, this was discussed. Past budget, throughout the year, it was discussed, before exec meeting, and then the options at exec as well. So personally, I don't find 4A valid either, and the other options were dismissed by the monitoring officer. So personally, I don't see anything in here of concern.
Thank you. Councillor Waller.
Thank you, Chair. For me, the basis of what I've been listening tonight is with the questions that members of the public put to me at a Macmillan coffee morning on the 27th of September. Why has this happened? And how do we reverse this? Which is a legitimate question to be put to councillors. But we don't have those details to say, well, this is stopping because this alternative is matching what you can currently receive. It's that that's missing, not the understanding of every permutation of possibilities that could have taken place. Councillor Rose, there was a very thorough review of virtually all of the council's expenditure between 2008, 2011, because Alistair Darling had put us on guard that there was going to be significant cut to public sector spending, whatever the result of the 2010 general election. So I'm left here as an elected councillor, duty bound to explain to the public why something has happened, and that's missing.
Thank you, Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. Now, I want to address the politicisation of by-election, because that is just totally and utterly wrong. I fundamentally opposed this saving when it was proposed. I believe Councillor Cole actually at that meeting, and I need to go back and check the tape, denied when I listed the services that were under threat, denied that they were actually part of the budget saving. So it's something that I was looking out for to give the proper level of scrutiny, because I knew the impact that this saving would have on so many vulnerable members. And it was only through digging through some of this paper bit, which is sort of the point, that we got to uncover that this was actually the unfolding of what that saving was actually meant to be. What's key to this, and we're being asked constantly over and over again to trust that the executive knew what they were doing, trust the executive had all the options, trust all that work was done. Well, the council leader said at executive that they hadn't overachieved any savings, that nothing over and above the 339 had been achieved. We've been told tonight that wasn't true. So the council leader was either wrong or misleading the public at that particular meeting. The exec members here today don't appear to be entirely clear on what they've ended, why, what duplication is, and what services there are. And I don't apologise for asking those questions, Councillor Coles, because the exec members' knowledge and understanding and grasp on this topic is what we're being asked to trust. And that's what we were trying to do. And it's worrying that she didn't know the totality of the contract. She didn't know what the totality of the savings were. It makes it difficult for us as a calling group to take her assurances. The problem with this is, and the reality is, that this paper was never about procuring new services, as Councillor Merritt alluded to. It was about ending a series of services and then re-procuring other ones. I've never known a thing before of savings being taken prior to re-provisioning. That is bad decision-making process. You don't decouple the services you're ending by months, sometimes even 6 to 7, 8 months, the service ending and then the re-provision potentially coming forward in 4 or 5 months. You take that in the round. The monitoring officer has helpfully put on this paper in black and white, the call-in's valid, for those particular reasons that should have been done. Why did these end? What we've heard tonight and throughout this is actually it was just the ending of the contract. There was no evidence. The ending of the contract in itself is not a reason. It may be a reason and there may be a better service, but actually all we've been told is, well, those are the ones that went because they ended. The reality is that's because that's easy. It's easy to allow contracts to lapse because you don't have to tell the public. And that's why we had the issues around the service that we're not allowed to name, because nobody knew. It was done in secret. It was let to lapse. And it was only when people turned up and were told that they weren't going to get that service anymore that it became public knowledge. That is poor decision making. I want to thank officers for the work that they've done and the help they've done. You were given a really difficult job, being asked to do this decoupling exercise to try and bury the cuts behind this suggestion of re-provision. And that's what you can see in the paper, a paper that's very difficultly trying to bridge that line of making it seem like a positive story about the 227 being re-procured, but not mentioning any of the 600,000 that's ending to fund it. And I take Councillor Merritt's point, but you can't decouple the two. That 227,000 is the balancing figure that's left when all the cuts have come. Therefore, discussing all those contracts is essential to where you get 227 from. Otherwise, it would be 237 or 270. So you have to have that full discussion about the finances of that contract, but also on the implications of that contract. Because the one thing that, and it's worrying that the opposite side of the table has never discussed this is about people. Nothing about this has actually been discussed about the impact on the people. The paper is very clear, by the way, that most of the services that are being ended are incredibly popular. I think the befriending service that you're ending is something like 92% of people in this paper said what a fantastic and life-changing service it is. You put that in the paper and then said, well, it's gone. We let that lapse, so we're going to procure something else.
I'll bring you in.
Once
I'll
again,
bring you in
we are
next.
not talking about the process, which is the remit of this committee.
I'll bring you in. I'll bring you in next, Councillor Merritt.
Pretty sure actually the impact of the service is one of the calling processes. And I think that is, I was going to leave about that fact about actually reflecting on what the impact of these changes are, what the impact of the new service, whether the new service as per the calling does cover the issues that have been lost from the services that have gone. And I think just a bit of a reality check, because the weakness of the callings, of your defence of the calling, has kind of been shown with this political attack on by-elections, which isn't true, and a fixation on the 10%, which was just a hypothetical number that's thrown out. And as someone who's worked in the voluntary sector for 15 years, it's absolutely commonplace for the voluntary sector to get an email come budget time to say, can you start monitoring what a 10%, 20%, 30% reduction in services would look like and how that works? The same thing happens in council departments. Cycle after cycle, that's not an unusual thing to have to do. And it's not a cliff edge thing that services would just die if it was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. It's a sensible conversation. It's sensible
Draw you
options.
to a close there, Councillor.
And it's what should have been in the paper.
Reach your 5-minute limit. Yes.
Can you just confirm for us that it isn't just that we're not allowed to name the service, which is the phrase that was just used. We're not allowed to discuss the service, and we're not allowed to make a decision on the merits of a service and a decision we don't like. The specific reasons for the calling that are valid are the only reasons we can say there's a problem.
In terms of the basis for all of our decision making, that's clear. Not having received any communication in writing from the monitoring officer about whether we can refer to services in the broadest sense without risk being accused of mentioning one service rather than another. I think members have tried to tread that line as best they can. And I fundamentally disagree with the conclusion the monitoring officer came for, but let's not reopen that.
I appreciate that point. I just want to make the point that I think it's pretty clear certain people are talking about certain contracts that aren't the subject of this call-in, or at least not subject of the remains of the call-in that are currently here. But I'll leave that to your discretion.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt.
There are important issues in this, absolutely, about people, but and about the council processes in terms of how it ends contracts. But those are matters that should have been taken to scrutiny rather than tried to tag them on to a call-in on this particular paper, which is about the issuance of 2 contracts. As you know, Ben and others have pointed out, this has been a complete abuse of process by the other group. You have used the wrong mechanisms. We have extensive arrangements for scrutiny in this council, which is what you should have been using, rather than abusing the call-in process. And you know, this needs to be. There's no breach here in terms of the actual paper that's come across, that's come in front of us.
Thank you, Councillor Crawshaw.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to echo that point by Councillor Merritt that there is a clear process for calling. It is about the process of decision making and about whether that decision is robust or otherwise. It's not about the be-alls and end-alls of whether or not we like the decision that got made in the first place. And that point was made right at the very start of this meeting. Similarly, the grounds on which a call-in can be heard are valid or otherwise. That doesn't necessarily attribute merit to the reason behind the call-in grounds that were presented. And I think that there's been quite a lot of misuse of language so far. None more so actually than the issues around trust and openness and transparency. And I think that we all just need to take a little step back here and just think about the broader context in which we operate, both locally, nationally and internationally. We're in a time of all kinds of outrageous slurs being made around trust and openness and transparency. And actually, for whatever any of us might think on any of the different political groups here, There is a paper with a lot of information in it. If any member wanted to get any clarity on anything that was in this paper prior to it being, well, from the point at which it was published in advance of the 10th of October, they were perfectly within their rights to write to any of either the officers or exec members who were relevant. And that information, generally speaking, is provided in a timely manner. Similarly, members of the public can do the same. So we can argue the toss over whether or not more or less detail should be in an individual paper. And I very much would question why this particular decision, out of a whole slew of decisions relating to the adult social care budget, has been called in. But if we're going to start casting around the notions of openness and transparency and criticising officers who aren't here to defend themselves in some cases, I think that that actually is more of a problem for this council and for the wider discussion that goes on in democratic accountability than it is about anything to do with this individual decision. As for the individual decision, it seems very clear to me that it's a procurement of 2 contracts, or a re-procurement or a new procurement, in the context of a whole slew of contracts which have been allowed to go over their time. They've been extended, in some cases, contracts, in fact, a lot of cases, contracts that began in 2017 that were for 3 years, that were then extended by another 2 years, then were waived and extended and extended. At any of those points, there should have been a procurement process to make sure that those contracts in 2017 were still fit for purpose in 2020 or 2021 or 2022 or whenever they were waived. That would be the case anyway, but in particular, when we think about the fundamentally changed context that we are all operating in from 2019 versus 2021. The world has completely changed, and yet a whole slew of contracts have just been rolled on and rolled on and rolled on. And then when they are actually being looked at in some detail and reviewed, it's being presented as some kind of opaque, Machiavellian, terrible stealth cuts that we somehow, nobody wants to make any cuts. Nobody wants to reduce services or do anything that is in any way impacting negatively on the people of this city. I don't think anybody of any political colour around this table wants to do that. But there is a hard reality that says that the world has changed. We don't have an infinite pot of money, and we've got to do the best that we possibly can, both as a council, but also working with partners across the city. And I think from what we've heard this evening from the exec members and from within the paper that's here and from various other papers that have been at executive and at budget council and will no doubt be coming forward, that conversation is ongoing and will continue to be ongoing to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can with the limited resources that we have. But in terms of a valid call-in reasons, I just don't see anything at all within this call-in other than, well, it's been said by others, and I don't need to say it again. What a waste of an evening.
Can't see any any of the hands. A few observations from me. I'll repeat what I've said at previous meetings in terms of, had an issue come to scrutiny for some pre-decision scrutiny work, A, we wouldn't be having this meeting because we would have fulfilled the constitutional requirement there to have been scrutiny, and some of the questions that have been raised in this call-in would no doubt have been teased out in that scrutiny discussion. I'm not laying blame for that anywhere. I'm just saying it's something we need to get into the habit of being better at. I welcome the fact that there is a review of scrutiny about to get underway, and I would ask members in the course of that engagement with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, we keep that at the forefront of our minds, because it will mean that everybody is more informed. You may still disagree with the decision that's eventually made, but we'll hopefully understand why. I think some of the concerns I had around this decision in terms of the process was really a lack of detail in the paper. And I'm not talking about additional reams and reams, but for example, where it says that the collaborative model option had been not pursued because within the current available budget, a collaborative model is a risk in relation to consolidated service offer. that needs to be unpacked in terms of what were the disadvantages of the model that had been pursued up to now in terms of collaborative model. That seems collaboration is normally a good thing. What's the advantages of an alternative model in terms of reducing duplication where it exists or driving efficiency? It was just some of the kind of throwaway lines in the report, on which I'm sure there's analysis that's gone on behind the scenes to inform that statement. But I read it and I thought, I don't know what that means. I don't know what, in what ways reducing a large number of contracts with a diversity of providers and reducing it to a smaller number, what that means, what are the advantages, what are the benefits for the council in terms of efficiency, but for service users as well. Later on, it goes on to talk about the proposal will have a positive impact in creating fairer and more equitable community provision. Again, it's unpacking that in terms of how will it be more equitable, how will it better target need. So I think it's those are the questions that to my mind remained unanswered in the report as drafted, and which I think some of which we've sort of discussed and tried to unpick a little bit this evening. Yeah, so those are my thoughts for what they're worth. Okay, we're nearly there. So the next stage is I will ask each committee member in turn to state whether they consider that the core principles identified in the call-in request were breached or not, giving reasons if they wish, or they do not feel the need to repeat points that have previously been made. So we will do this alphabetically. So I will ask each member in turn whether they consider the core principles have been breached or whether there is no breach. Oh, I'll use this one, okay. The official one. Councillor Eyre.
I like the fact you happen to be held to the alphabet, Chair. That's concerning. Clear breach.
Councillor Benburton.
Yeah, thanks. No breach.
Councillor Coles.
No breach.
Councillor Crawshaw.
No breach.
Councillor Healy.
Breach.
Councillor Merritt.
No breach.
Councillor Maroney.
No breach.
Councillor Rose.
No breach.
Councillor Waller.
Breach.
Councillor Widdowson. Councillor Whitcroft.
No breach.
Me, breach. So the totals are 5 members considering there has been a breach and 7 no breach. We will now repeat that exercise with a show of hands. So can I ask all those members who consider there has been a breach, please indicate now. Yes. And let's keep order, please. And all those members who consider there has been no breach, please indicate. And the result is the same as before. Therefore, the committee has ruled that there is no breach. So the decision will not be referred back to executive. At this point, members may, if they wish, continue the meeting to suggest or discuss any areas worthy of future exploration via the scrutiny function. Would anybody like to say anything in that regard, in addition to what's already been said about the value of scrutiny? No, thank you. There is no urgent business, therefore I wish you all a pleasant evening. Good night.